All right, let's move on to the next war. So Netanyahu is apparently furious that Benny Gantz, who is the opposition leader, he is his number one rival in the Israeli government. He has landed in the United States and has been meeting with United States officials. He met with Kamala Harris yesterday. So this is sort of, very much undermining Netanyahu. This was not a meeting that Netanyahu sanctioned in any way. He didn't give the go-ahead for Benny Gantz to come to the United States and discuss things. So clearly, this is showing the fact that his opposition has shown up to the United States and is meeting with leaders, meeting with Kamala Harris and others. This clearly is showing that the United States is very much at their wits' end when it comes to Netanyahu. Still not enough to pull the funding for Israel. Still not enough to call for a ceasefire, although Kamala Harris did, which kind of makes you wonder if they're trying to inch her into the slot to take over for Joe Biden. But this is the story here. This is from Haaretz, which is a major newspaper in Israel. Israeli source: enraged Netanyahu trying to undermine Gantz's U.S. visit. Furious at War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz's invitation to Washington. Netanyahu is determined to signal to the American government that it's meeting with the wrong Benjamin, as the ties between Israeli PM and President Biden grow increasingly strained. Israeli War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz landed Sunday in the United States in what senior Israeli officials said was a calculated move by the White House designed to strengthen the moderate wing of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government. Gantz is scheduled to meet with senior officials, including White House meetings with Vice President Kamala Harris, which he did meet with her yesterday, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on Monday. He will also meet with Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Middle East envoy Brett McGurk and pay a call to Congress. So he's showing up, having these discussions. Maybe they're going to maybe there's some ideas that he's got a better way of handling what's going on there. It says Gantz's visit comes amid strained relations between Netanyahu and U.S. President Joe Biden and the hard line in Israel being led by National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. Those guys are the ones who are, they use genocidal language, nothing short of genocidal language, and they are Netanyahu's right-hand men at this point, and they're leading the charge on just trying to wipe everybody out of Palestine, out of Gaza. I'm sure out of the entire Palestine, ideally, is what they would want. But this is clearly showcasing that the U.S. is very frustrated that the world is really against Israel. So this is what's interesting about this is, you've got all these people who are still very much on the side of Israel in this war. They're very much, they think that the Palestinians are lying. They call it Pollywood, when they show video of the destruction and the despair and the massacres happening in Gaza. That's what they're calling it. But this is showing that if you can get to the point where even the United States is frustrated, I mean, not enough. The U.S. is too dependent on the Israeli-American lobby and doesn't really want to piss them off because they need money for the elections. So they don't want to stop the funding to Israel. But this is the next step of showcasing that they're unhappy. So not willing to go along with any sort of UN security measures. Of course, they're vetoing those. They're still giving endless funding to Israel. But this is showcasing that there is quite a bit of tension. This is showcasing that the United States is even not really on Israel's side when it comes to this war. So if you could get to a point where the U.S. is not on the side of Israel in this war, then I don't know how anybody could defend it. I don't know how there's still all these people on social media, in various media outlets, establishment media outlets. I don't know how any of them are still standing on the side of Israel when you can turn even the staunchest ally of Israel against Israel, essentially, in their own way, in their own twisted way that is not near far enough, because we're not talking about political funding and donors. We're talking about people's lives. We're talking about children. The starvation that is now happening in Gaza, the U.S. now airdropping aid into Gaza. There's just a lot of moving parts here. But what is Benny Gantz going to do that's different than Netanyahu? If they can oust Netanyahu from the prime minister role, Benny Gantz was in the prime minister role just before Netanyahu took it back over. Not really sure if Benny Gantz has a better solution. Not really sure. Maybe he would be more amenable to a two-state solution. That is something that Netanyahu said we're not doing. We're not doing a two-state solution. Netanyahu has also made it really clear that there's never going to be a ceasefire, even if the hostages are released. A lot of people think that, well, if they just released the hostages, the war would end. And Netanyahu's made it clear over and over and over again that that's not the case. So I'm not really sure what Benny Gantz is going to do, because here's the thing. Even the moderates in Israel are far right extreme when it comes to the Palestinians. They have moved as a country further and further and further to the extreme, to where moderates are now extreme and the extremists are now really extreme, like Ben Gvir and Smotrich. Extremely extreme, genocidal extreme. And the people who were more about peace with Palestine are now considered the centrists. They have moved to the center. They don't really, their idea of peace is not the same idea of peace that they had a decade ago or even 20 years ago. But this is showcasing that there is a tension there. Now let's move on to the peace talks, the negotiation. There's a negotiation here happening with Hamas. They're trying to do truce talks, but Israel isn't showing up to those. Israel had a deal that they put forward on the table 6 weeks in exchange for all of the hostages. The problem with Israel, like I mentioned, is they're saying that it doesn't matter if they get all their hostages back. They're going to continue to go forward with the war until Hamas is eradicated. They keep saying this over and over again, but Hamas is an ideology. It's a political party. It's like saying, we're not stopping until every Trump supporter, until we eradicate Trump support for Trump, until we eradicate MAGA. We're not going to stop fighting until we eradicate MAGA. You're not going to be able to do that. And not only that, but if you do, who rises up? Who rises up once Hamas is gone? You're going to end up with another radical organization, and that's what Israel banks on. That's what's been going on over and over the last, for 75 years, is that they would look at the current Palestinian, like the current Palestinian Authority, for example, and they say, oh, they're terrorists. We can't work with them. And then what rises up? Hamas, a more extreme organization, rises up. But here's the article from Al Jazeera. Hamas officials arrive in Cairo for Gaza truce talks, but no sign of Israel. Hamas officials have arrived in Cairo, Egypt, for talks on securing a truce in the Gaza war after a U.S. official indicated that Israel had endorsed a framework for a temporary ceasefire and exchange of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners. So the framework has been 1 day for every one hostage. That is what Israel wants. So you give a hostage, we'll give you 1 day. That buys them 6 weeks. But the problem is that Israel said to Hamas, we now want a list of all of the hostages who are alive, and Hamas refused to give them that list. Now, why would Hamas refuse to give them that list? Because, one would deduce that maybe there just aren't that many alive anymore. Maybe there's quite a few who have died in one way or another, or they're lost. Remember, these hostages had been kind of, from what we understood, the hostages have been spread out all around the entirety of Gaza, and various different organizations like the PLJ and Hamas had some, and there were some, other groups that had been taking in hostages. And so they were housing them all around. When the entire area is being bombed, I would imagine it's difficult to keep track of them. I would imagine they get lost. I would imagine that some of them are under the rubble. I would imagine that Hamas has not been able to keep track of these hostages, and that's why they're not willing to give the list. I don't think they're not giving them the list for any other reason other than they just don't know. There's no reason for them not to give the list. They've been giving the list. They've been saying who they have in their custody this entire time. So the fact that they won't give them the list now, the list could be a lot smaller. The living hostages list could be a lot smaller than what Israel wants, what even Hamas wishes. And that buys the Palestinians in Gaza less time. If the trade is 1 for 1, 1 day for one hostage, and you have half of the hostages you once had, you're going to end up with fewer days. And so maybe that's why they don't want to release the list. It's unclear. I mean, we could just speculate. I can't imagine what other reason they wouldn't release that list other than they just don't know, or the people are dead. Goes on to say that Hamas representatives arrived in Cairo on Sunday, but early evening there was no delegation from Israel for the talks mediated by envoys from Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, with Israeli media reporting that Israel had not sent a team after the Palestinian group declined to share a list of captives who were still alive in the besieged territory. Quote, there's no Israeli delegation in Cairo. Israeli outlet Ynet quoted unidentified Israeli officials as saying, quote, Hamas refuses to provide clear answers and therefore there's no reason to dispatch the Israeli delegation. Well, sure there is. I mean, look, if they don't know who's alive anymore because they're potentially buried, they've been lost in the scattering of all the people throughout Gaza, you'd want a ceasefire in order to at least count your hostages. I mean, that would be one reason to do it, to demand, look, we'll stop firing on you, we'll stop bombing you, we'll start sending in aid, but we demand a head count. We demand proof of life. I mean, that would be the first step, I would imagine. Allow them the time in some, without chaos, to count who they have. The other reason why you'd want to stop and you'd want to have a ceasefire is because you just don't want to continue to be homicidal maniacs, right? Or genocidal maniacs. You'd want to stop and realize that the world is against you. You've done a lot of damage. You say you're going to try to eradicate Hamas, yet you allow the Hamas leaders to continue hiding out wherever it is they're hiding out. They're not in Gaza. You've got one guy in Gaza who they say they've lost contact with. They're not sure where he is. So they've said that there's going to be some difficulty having negotiations when the one Hamas leader hasn't been heard from in a week. Maybe he's dead. Who knows? Or maybe he's just, again, the place is destroyed. So it'd be difficult to get a hold of him, difficult to contact people, difficult to figure out where people are. But they continue to bombard. They continue to make it very difficult for the Palestinian civilians to survive. They think that, and that's clearly not a strategy that's working. So if their strategy is just make life in Palestine and Gaza so unbearable that Hamas gives up, well, they've done that and it's not working. And they've also said to Hamas, look, you give us all of our hostages, we'll give you 1 day for every hostage, but then after that, we're still coming after you. That doesn't seem like a very good deal for the Palestinian people. Like, oh, you're going to give us 6 weeks or you're going to give us 4 weeks of time to do what? So the other thing Hamas wants in this negotiation, I think it's a smart thing for them to be asking for, is they're asking for a return for the Palestinians up to the north. They want to ensure that the Palestinian people are not being ethnically cleansed from the land. They want to ensure that Israel isn't going to take over the land and start building settlements. So part of these negotiations, they're not willing to accept anything other than what needs to be part of the negotiation is they want the hostages to be able to return to the north. Now, Israel has come back and said, well, why? It's destroyed. I can't imagine why you'd want to do that, right? Which was the exact reason why they destroyed it. I mean, the fact that the leaders are now saying, why would you want to do that? It's, there's no hospitals, there's no schools, there's no nothing up there. I mean, geez, that just goes to show what their plan was to begin with. The reason why they wiped everything off the map up in the north was because they didn't want people to want to return. And they're shocked that people want to return, that the Hamas wants to negotiate for a return of the people. Gaza was already a highly populated, densely populated area. And then they condensed everybody into an even smaller area. Now the Palestinians want to return home. They're going to have to rebuild. It's going to be terrible. They're going to be living amongst rubble in the north. But to Palestinians, resistance is existence. Being on the land, not being displaced, not being shoved into Egypt, not being carted off on boats to Lebanon or wherever else the Israelis want to take them as their grand master plan to ethnically cleanse the land and to take it over for themselves. The Palestinians just think being there is the resistance. So they want to return, and that's part of the negotiations. And I do think that that is a smart angle for the negotiation. It would ensure, for a period of time. I mean, I would still imagine that Israel would allow the people to go up to the north, and then they'd say, but look, they can't stay. There's no services. There's no hospitals. There's no schools. There's no roads. There's nothing. There's nowhere for them to live. Nothing's habitable. So they can't really stay. I mean, we'll let them go up there and we'll let them sit for a couple of months. But then after that, there needs to be a long-term solution, which includes removing the Palestinian people out of Gaza so that Israel can go in and rebuild as Israel, rebuild the land as Israel. So we'll keep an eye on these negotiations. But Israel's offering a bum deal. They're just their whole thing is we're not going to stop under any circumstance. That is a problem with Netanyahu. That is why the U.S. government is now meeting with Benny Gantz. That's probably why they're trying to find some other ally in the Israeli government, because Netanyahu has made it clear nothing stops this war. Nothing stops this war until they defeat Hamas, which is an ideology. And once they defeat Hamas, then they're going to turn around and say, oh, but the PLJ is here. Oh, but there's this other organization and they're terrorists and we can't allow them. It's just going to be a never-ending shifting of the narrative and the moving the goalposts, and that's what we've seen. We've seen that for 75 years. We're seeing that now. The whole goal, we know the goal, it is to ethnically cleanse all of the Palestinians off of the land. And they're unfortunately doing a very good job of that. But hopefully Netanyahu is on his way out. Hopefully somebody else is on their way in. And hopefully there can be some sort of diplomatic solution to this. It's kind of, it feels like a real lost cause. Hey guys, be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you like this segment. Now you might be wondering, this seems like it's part of a bigger show. You're right, it is. The full show is at KimIversonShow.com. So what you're watching is just a clip. And if you want to get the full experience, then you got to go to KimIversonShow.com. The show airs Monday through Friday, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern at KimIversonShow.com. That is where you can watch the full show. Here, you just get clips. So click on the link down below, go to the full show, enjoy. Otherwise, I'll see you next time right here. And be sure, once again, like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.